Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the UOH History webinar series again. This is the 11th talk in the series, now being done by Dr. Manu V. Devadevan. Dr. Manu teaches currently at the Indian Institute of Technology at Mandi in Himachal Pradesh. He's attached with the School of Humanities and Social Sciences over there. And we are very happy to have such a young, promising scholar today speaking to us. And Manu's biography is inspirational in many ways to youngsters who want to take academics seriously in general and history in particular. Not only because of the multiple dispositions that he combines in his personality, that of a poet, of a writer, a translator, a textbook writer, a historian, etc., and also his proficiency in many languages, right? But also due to his determination, that he has shown to become a historian. I understand that he has started his career as a clerical staff in the Indian Railways, way back in 1996. And then he was pursuing his studies as well through distance mode. And 5 years later, he quit the job as he was getting a lot of chance as employee of railways to travel all around India and see places of historical importance, which made him to develop some interest in history. And he left the job in 5 years and joined for a master's in history in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and subsequently did his PhD from the Mangalore University with Professor Keshwan Vidata. Manu usually paints himself as an economic historian, but someone who is interested in related processes as well, related processes of culture, politics, and also the entangling issues of institutions, ideas, identities, traditions, practices, etc. So as a result, if you look at his work, he actually deals with a wide range of issues and themes, as you can see. His publications actually stand in testimony of this range of issues that actually he deals with. His first book came out in 2016. It's not the first one. I mean, the first, perhaps in English. A prehistory of Hinduism, which was published in 2016, which takes a view different from the primordialist and totalizing assumptions of Hinduism, and locate Hinduism in its pluralities and also in a long-term historical evolution. And his new book is just published, which is the early medieval origins of India. It is after seeing the announcements about this book, I contacted Manu for this talk, which again basically takes look into the pluralities of India and in its evolution, perhaps many origins of India, and he tried to locate these through the evolution of vernacular languages, literary traditions, performance practices, pilgrim centers, making of identities, etc. And then offers this provocative thesis that India, as we know today, is significantly a product of the early medieval times. And he has also done a lot of translation, the first of which is published as a book, God is Dead, There is No God, the translation of Kannada Vachanas of the 12th century Saint Allama Prabhu. And he's currently working on another translation, the Vachanas of Akka Mahadevi. And more importantly, last year, he won this prestigious Infosys Prize for Humanities, conferred by the Infosys Science Foundation, which consists of a gold medal, citation, and a $100,000 as prize purse. And the distinguished jury has mentioned and commented his work for his highly original and wide-ranging issues, highly original work and wide-ranging issues with regard to pre-modern South India. And also they applauded him for the profound knowledge of sources in multiple languages, particularly literature and inscription. So we are very happy to have Manu today, such a promising young scholar. Manu is a big inspiration for the achievements that he has already have, but at the same time, he's a big promise for all the more outstanding achievements yet to come. So now, may I request my colleague, Professor Suchandra Ghosh, to moderate the session and take over.
Well, I don't think we should waste any more time. And because we have such a brilliant historian of early India with us today, it's really a pleasure and a rare occasion that we get to hear him. And so directly, yes, Manu, Dr. Devadevan, Manu Devadevan, please enlighten us with your vachanas, with Bhava and Rasa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Varghese, for that rather generous introduction, and thank you, Suchandra, as well. I was planning to deliver this lecture about 6 months back in another platform, also in Hyderabad. I had even planned to visit Hyderabad at the time, but then because of the lockdown and pandemic and so on, the event was called off. So I'm presenting the same paper today. I wrote this paper in 2018 when the Shabarimala controversy, the controversy over women's entry into the Shabarimala temple in Kerala was going on. So I'll be saying something about that as well towards the end of the paper. Not about Shabarimala per se, but the larger issues involved with it. Now the title of my paper is The Time of Rasa and the Time of Bhava, Kannada Wordscape in Transition, CA 900 to 1200 CE. Between the mid-10th century and the late 12th century, the production of Kavya literature in Kannada developed into a formidable tradition. It drew its models from the works of Bhava, who had earned recognition by the 13th century as the first poet, Adi Kavi, in the language. The poet called Madhura in the 13th century, who called Bhava for the first time as Adi Kavi, that's in a work called the Aadhi Puranam. Bhava was a court-sponsored model of poetry. Aesthetically, it drew upon the Kaviraja Margam extensively. The Kaviraja Margam was a work on poetics, composed in the Rashtrakuta court of Mogavarsha I in the 9th century. It is now recognized as the oldest surviving literary text in Kannada. In the course of its evolution, this literary model produced such works as Chandraraja's Madana Tilakam, a work on erotics, and Andaya's Kapigara Kavya, also on erotics, a piece of erotic poetry, that claimed distinction as a work which refrained from the use of Sanskrit words. Bhamva's model met with a serious challenge with the growth of a genre of Shaivite songs in the mid-12th century.
Manu.
Known as
Hello.
Later,
Manu. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Manu.
Yeah. Is there a problem?
Manu, I think. Manu, some some noise is coming in the background. Can you come a little closer? Or,
Riverbank that's roaring all the time. Is there too much of disturbance?
I think so. Your voice is breaking and we are unable to catch it fully.
Yeah, the voice is breaking actually. That is the main problem.
Yeah.
Don't mind them.
You want to switch off your video and speak? Would that help?
I could do that.
Yeah, maybe
Can
try.
you please try that?
Ask him to rejoin. Ask him to rejoin.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
It is better. It is better.
Sounds better. Sounds
It's
better.
better.
Okay. I'll continue this way then.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is better.
okay.
Yeah. Also, I live almost 20 kilometers from the town. So the connectivity is also a problem here. So I was talking about the genre of poetry that Pampa pioneered in the 10th century, and it produced works such as the Kapigara Kava and the Madana Tilakam. And this model met with a great challenge in the mid 12th century. That was with the growth of a genre of poetry called Vachana. It was originally known as Geetam, but then conferred recognition as Vachana. This process of composing vachanas commenced in the 11th century, rather on a small scale. It snowballed into a powerful mode of expression in the third quarter of the 12th century. That is between 1150 and 1175. These were also the years, that is the third quarter of the 12th century was also the time when the Kalyana Chalukya state, which held sway over large parts of Deccan for more than 2 centuries, had begun to disintegrate. The Kalyana Chalukya state, the Chalukyas had come to power in the year 972. The Vachanas changed the world of letters in historically decisive ways, but they did not claim recognition as kavyas and were not identified as works of literature until the 20th century. So the Vachanas did not mark a break in kavya conventions. That break came with Harihara and his nephew Raghavanka in the last quarter of the 12th century. The uncle and nephew moved away from existing forms of court poetry and composed hagiographic kavyas on the lives of the Shaiva saints from the Kannada, Tamil, as well as Telugu-speaking regions. With the wide-ranging innovations that Harihara and Raghavanka brought into effect, the model which Pampa had pioneered began to lose its appeal. The early 13th century poet Janna was the last major poet to work with the old model. He was a member of the Hoysala court, but a few less accomplished poets continued to keep the model alive even in later times. Now, much has been written in Kannada on the transition from the age of Pampa to the age of Harihara and Raghavanka. The transition is often recognized as a shift from Jaina to Shaiva or Veerashaiva literature. It is, in addition, also identified as marking the evolution of the language itself, the Kannada language transitioning from Old Kannada, that is Halagannada, to Mid Kannada, Nadu Kannada. Now, Harihara's oeuvre it's thought to represent the historic moment of departure from the old to the new. The existing studies are voluminous, of course. These are not in English. I'm talking about the Kannada studies, but they do not reflect upon how Pampa's model came to hold a sway that it did for almost 250 years, or what in Harihara and Raghavanka made the old model rather redundant. These works presume that it was the lasting merit, quality, or greatness of the works that made them popular. That is to say, the success of Pampa's model had to do with the features that were intrinsic to the works. It is mighty uncertain what becomes of Pampa's lasting attributes, as it were, when Harihara and Raghavanka arrives on the scene. Now, in the lecture today, I want to share some thoughts on the two kavyas that Pampa is known to have composed, the Vikramarjuna Vijayam or Pampa Bharatam and the Aadhi Puranam. I'll tell you why the two works became the source of a powerful convention that lasted for 2.5 centuries. I'll then examine the vachanas of two prominent Shaiva saints from the 12th century, Allama Prabhu and Basava. Here, I'll discuss the character of the challenge that the vachanas posed to the world of court poetry. So I'll start. The discussion centers on the manner in which time was imagined in Pampa and how the Vachanas reject this mode of conceptualizing time to provide a forceful alternative. I'll argue that the shift from Pampa to the Vachanas was a shift from a corporal understanding of time to a cognitive understanding of time. Pampa was a poet in the court of the Vemulavada Chalukya chief Arikesari II.
Manu?
Arikesari
Man-
was a
Manu.
tributary of three successive Rashtrakuta rulers, four in fact, Amogha Varsha II, Govinda IV, Amogha Varsha III, and Krishna III. He wielded enormous influence and was one of the most powerful rulers in the Kannada and Telugu-speaking region during the 10 odd years between the demise of Indra III, that would be 929, and the rise to power of Krishna III, 939. Arikesari contracted matrimonial alliances with the Rashtrakutas and played an important role in ousting Govinda before to bring Amogha III to power in 936. Pampa's ancestors belonged to the Vengi region, that is the Krishna Godavari Delta, from where they moved to Annigiri near Gadag. Born in the year 902-903 Dunduvi Samvatsara, he completed the Aadhi Puranam in 941. The date of the Pampa Bharatam is not recorded. The Aadhi Puranam is the earlier of the two and finds mention in the latter. It is reasonable, I guess, to trace the Pampa Bharatam to a date not later than 945. So I would even say 955 because Arikesari was alive until at least 955. The Adi Puranam is an abridged Kannada rendering of the Sanskrit Purva Purana of Jinasena. So this is the Mahapurana actually. The first part written by Jinasena is the Purva Purana, and his disciple Gunabhadra composed the remaining parts of it, and that's the Uttara Purana. It recounts the life cycles or bhavas of Adinatha, the first Jaina Tirthankara, and also tells the story of the famous rivalry between his sons Bharata and Bahubali. The text remains faithful to its source with little digression from Jinasena's narrative. The Pampa Bharatam, on the other hand, is a retelling of the Mahabharata with Arjuna as hero. One can see in the Pampa Bharatam the influence of Bharavi's Kirata Arjuniya and to a limited extent Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha. Existing studies I get do not consider Bharavi's influence seriously. They speak at length about the influence of Raghuvamsha in the text. Both works of Pampa were bold experiments that turned out to be enormously successful. The form that Pampa chose was the Champu, in which verses were regularly interspersed with prose passages. The use of such a blend occurred in a few literary works from earlier times. The best known among them is the Jatakamala, but its conscious use as a genre in Kavya was new to South Asia. Although mentioned in the Kavyadarsha of Dandi, that would be the late 7th century, it had never been tried before Pampa's time, except in a marginally successful work produced in the Rashtrakuta court of Indra III. And that is barely 2 decades before Pampa actually commenced writing. This is the Nalachampu of Trivikrama Bhatta. The Pampa Bharatam was a political project. It was in effect a prashasti writ large. There is a stanza towards the end of the text where Pampa calls his work Samara Shlagya Prashasti Krama, that is a laudable prashasti of military exploits. Pampa's innovation involved grafting the image of his patron onto the figure of the hero of the Kavya to produce a narrative that is simultaneously an account of the exploits of Arjuna as well as the exploits of Arikesari. This model gained acceptance. Two more works conceived on similar lines appeared in Kannada in subsequent decades, that is in about a half a century's time. The first of these, Ponnas Bhuvanaika Rama Bidayam, has not survived. It seems to have been an account of the chief Shankara Ganda of Banavasi, who was equated with the hero of the Ramayana. Shankaraganta had the title Vanaika Rama. Some would even argue that it is Krishna the third because he had this title as well. The second text, Ranna's Sahasa Bhima Vijayam, also known as Gadha Yuddham, tells the story of the Mahabharata, drawing parallels between Bhima and Ranna's patron Satyashraya, who was at this time crown prince under his father Taila II, who established the Kalyana Chalukya state in 972. The Pampa Bharatam and the Aadhi Puranam differed from each other in their approaches to the problem of human existence. The former, drawn from the Itihasa Purana traditions, was a text of world conquest. The latter, based on Jaina legends, sang praise of the ethic of renunciation. Pampa was conscious of this difference. He was conscious of this difference, which he identified as the difference between the worldly, Laukika, and the transcendental, the Agamika. This was essentially a difference between the here and the hereafter, and as we shall soon see, a difference between being inside of time and being beyond time. Pampa did not see a conflict here, as some 20th century Indologists would do, who talk about the inner conflict of tradition, for instance. That was because conquest formed the ideational basis in both cases. The worldliness in the Pampa Bharatam being a conquest of the other, and the renunciation in the Adi Puranam, a conquest of the self to become a Jina, the paradigmatic conqueror. The Pampa Bharatam has a little to tell us on the life of Arikesari II. It is prima facie retelling of the Mahabharata. There are no comparisons of Arjuna's exploits in the epic with any known battle that Arikesari might have fought. We get snippets of Arikesari's life in the first chapter. Here, we are introduced to him as the protege of the Rashtrakuta king Indra III. Arikesari is said to have had his cradle, for his cradle, the shoulders of Indra III, who Pampa tells us is none other than Indra, the deity. This suggestion tacitly points to the father-son relationship between Indra and Arjuna in the epic. The comparison that Pampa makes is for most parts by way of using the patron's name, Arikesari, and his title, Gunarnava, to signify Arjuna, and the name Arjuna, in turn, as a synonym for Arikesari. The first chapter ends with the birth of Arjuna in Shatashranga and the name-giving rite, the Namakarana, that follows. In this ceremony, members from the court of Indra and the court of Brahma confer upon him 108 names. And those of us who are familiar with South Indian epigraphy would identify that most of these are titles that Arikesari and his contemporaries had. The emphasis of the text is not on a narrative comparison between the events in the Mahabharata, events in the life of Arjuna and Arikesari, but on the ideal of valor and the end it serves, victory. In this sense, human existence, in its limited sense as fortitude and victory, is a recursive affair, an ideational continuity that had its beginning at the time of creation. Time moves in the form of a spiraling linearity, the linearity in it involving movement without progress or change. The recursive quality of human existence is hinted at towards the end of each chapter of the Pampa Bharatam, where Pampa presents the narrative as originating at the beginning of time. In Pampa's understanding, the Mahabharata is a Jaina epic, which is primordial, as it is born of the holy offering from the feet of the Jina, Jina Padamboja Vara Prasadotpanna. It embodies the kernel of human existence, which in this case centers on the ideal of victory, and can be presented as a narrative to extol his own patron's exploits as well. And for this reason, it does not call for the production of narratives other than the ones that the Itihasa Purana tradition already embodies in exemplifying terms. Emphasis on the recursive character of time occurs at various places in the text in different forms. In the 9th chapter, for instance, where when Virata Raja learns of the true identity of the Pandava siblings living in his court and disguise, he urges Yudhishthira to accept his daughter Uttara as bride for Arjuna's son Abhimanyu. Yudhishthira agrees to the proposal, declaring that their relationship was not created now, but had come down without break from the time of Hiranyagarbha, from the time of Brahma. A primordial relationship that began at the commencement of the world is only being reenacted now. Pampa constructs a tightly woven narrative imbued with action after action in quick succession. Moments of serious reflections or thoughtful deliberations blend into the narrative structure in a manner that promotes the larger objective of producing a prashasti. They are not self-directed. They do not have an existence as ethical subtext either. Lengthy scenes occur at several places in the Pampa Bharatam, which given our present purpose, we must overlook. But it must be noted that these concerns spring from the ideal of valor and not from the ideal of reason, which is a proposition that is of some consequence to our argument. Pampa's thrust on valor informs the choices he makes from the Mahabharata. The didactic sections of the epic do not find a place in this work. The narrative begins with the account of Shantanu after a telescope genealogy of the line is recounted in 5 stanzas. It draws to a close with the end of the battle and the coronation of Arjuna. The coronation of Arjuna, not Yudhishthira. The last 7 parvas of the Mahabharata, Shanti Parva to Swargarohana Parva, are not included. The Bhagavad Gita is missing. Most episodes from the Vana Parva are discarded. In fact, the sections corresponding to the Vana Parva opens with an account of Arjuna's journey and penance for obtaining the Pashupata from Shiva. Pampa models this section closely after Bharavi's Kiratarjuniya. This account is nearly a chapter long, and there the Vanaparva more or less draws to a close. In the next 2 dozen stanzas, half a dozen events from the 12-year exile are recounted. These include Rambha's curse on Arjuna, Rambha's curse, not Urvashi's, Bhima's meeting with Hanuman, and the Yaksha Prashna episode. We then find the Pandavas and Draupadi in Viratanagara. The choices that Pampa makes enable him to produce a text that involves a few digressions from the kernel of the Mahabharata. A modern reader cannot be struck by the skillful storytelling that keeps him or her on the edge. Pampa is a master of descriptive poetry, Varnaka poetry, but it is in the Aadhi Puranam that we meet with prolonged descriptive sections. The descriptive parts of the Pampa Bharatam have a brevity which ensures that there is no rupture in storytelling. So it's a kind of, there is no rupture in storytelling. That's what I'm trying to argue here. Now I'll argue the other way around. The flow and integrity of the narrative notwithstanding, it is paradoxical that the Pampa Bharatam was historically successful because of the perpetual breaches in narration that Pampa caused in the text. We are faced with the unavoidable fact that there is no narration in the Vikramarjuna Vijayam. The text drives the attention of the reader or the listener away from the story in every one of its lines with its textured vocabulary and a specific form of sonic orchestration. There is a story, and the story is masterfully told, but the poet's lexical and sonic choices are directed towards serving ends other than storytelling. For Pampa's objective is to produce an extended piece of panegyric, not to tell a story which is all too well known. It is with this question of Pampa's lexical choices and the ends that they serve that the poet's vision of time and its embedding in the text is intertwined. A characteristic feature of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages used in India is their ability to produce lengthy compounds, samasas, of an agglutinative character. Another vital feature is their openness to alliteration, prasa, not necessarily in the form of the first, second, or end syllable rhyme. The use of alliteration on a vast scale is not dependent on the occurrence of involved compound constructions, but the compounds, the samasas, facilitate their widespread use. The finest use of alliterations is noticed in Dravidian languages, but it was put to great effect in several Sanskrit texts too. The best known being Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, Leela Suka's Sri Krishna Karnamrita, and the two anonymous texts attributed to Shankara, Saundarya Lahari and Shivananda Lahari. In the hands of Bharavi, Magha, and their successors, it took the form of Yamaka, which Kalidasa had experimented with in the 9th canto of the Raghuvamsha. Now, Pampas is a royal prashasti composed in the form of what he calls a prabandha. The success of such a text is at the mercy of the extent to which it can evoke the mood or emotion associated with valor, that is to say, Veera Rasa. I propose that alliteration, combined with the right choice of words in terms of meaning, is arguably the most effective way of producing a rasa. In lesser hands, it can turn out to be unbearably mechanical as well. In the Kannada text, rasa is not so much product of the force of narration in terms of the intensity of plot constructions uh, or the depth of the character's mind that the poet succeeds in descending into. It is in fact the outcome of the force that these aspects of narration gain through the sonic orchestration of signifiers. In this scheme of things, signifiers only bring to mind the signified. The affects of the signified, the affects, are propelled into being only by the sonic force of the respective signifiers. This little appreciated aspect of poetics is central to Pampa's text, as it is through the sonic play of alliteration that he suffuses the Pampa Bharatam with Veera Rasa. The letters that Pampa picks up for repetition embody Uttaha, the abiding emotion or Sthai Bhava behind Veera Rasa. Consider this line, for instance. Antu nabhobhagadim bhumi bhaga kilidu tanna munde nindara vinda bandhavana nodi nodi. This is a piece of prose. It's a piece of prose. The line is not constrained by the demands made of it in a meter. The expression could have been Agasadim Bhumi Girdu, descending from the sky to the earth, with the charm of its simplicity. Yet, Pampa renders it as Nabho Bhagadim Bhumi Bhaga Girdu with the phonic Bha used 4 times and the word Bhaga twice, corresponding to the 4 uses of Bha are the 4 uses of Nda in the late part of the line. Munde Nindara Vinda Bandhavana. This example is from the prose which occurs just before verse 92 of the first chapter. 2 instances are picked randomly, verse 92 from chapter 4 and verse 92 from chapter 11, should highlight the quality of lexical choices that Pampa makes. Now this is verse 92 of chapter 4. Forget its meaning, just listen to how it sounds. Vesanadodambadingalasi mandodam intidan even endodam pusidodam asedori bagedoriodam neradirdodam sakatisitodam ayamum chalalumullode pesadavalge mattamatiಸುವುದೆ ಮತ್ತಮಂಜುವುದೆ ಮತ್ತಮಳಲುವುದೆ ಮತ್ತಮಿಯುವುದೆ. The rhythm that the alliterations create is not synchronized with the rhythm of the meter that might then either induce a measure of monotony in their occurrence or produce a musical effect, a laya, that is liable to be hijacked to evoke a diversity of moods. The regularity causing the rhythm here depends on the specific ways of recitation meant to generate a specific mood. In the other example, which is verse 92 from chapter 11, the deployment of the word krama grabs attention to the detriment of the meaning of the verse. It's a very highly meaningful stanza, but once you listen to it, you are lost in the use of the word krama rather than in the meaning of it. This is what it sounds like. Kramamam keikolal endu puttiranadul savenegam mandod akramamakkum kramamakkume kramamanan egeidevam vikramam kramamam vikramadatanim kramadamatantirke mandirdodam kramakendirdene vittodam vidadodam vilkondenim mandane. This is Pampa's method of generating the Veera Rasa, and you find it in every stanza. I just picked up 3 instances randomly, occurring in every verse and sections of the prose that he composes. The Pampa Bharatam comes to be permeated with sonic rhythms devised to evoke the mood of valor. This mood encrusts the otherwise dexterously crafted narrative to make it less a narrative text and more a pretext for generating the affect of valor. There is then no love, no sorrow, no compassion or other such moods in the text, only valorous love, valorous sorrow, valorous compassion, and such like. Here, for instance, is what transpires between Kunti and Madri upon the death of Pandu. I'll just read out a short extract in translation. What if you have left me and the children I raised in this forest here without a word? I'll come after you, king. How will I live without you? She said, that is Kunti said. And then she speaks to Madri. Accept the children and raise them. Give me my beloved. I'll become what he has beloved. To which Madri replied, my beloved has granted me the turn today. Will I in any way let off my turn for you? Take my children into your care. Don't blabber anything else. This is a wife grieving at the loss of her husband, a vintage of Pampa. The poet seems to be telling us that no grief is grief unless it is stroked or ruffled by a breeze of valor. Valor is not limited in our poet's aesthetic to the choices of or themes or the method devised in relation to form. It is represented as the raison d'etre of human existence. Here is the scene where Parashurama approaches Bhishma with a request to accept Amba as his wife. A few more lines in translation. Learning of Parashurama's arrival in Nagapura, that is Hastinapura, Gangeya arrived, offered him waters in vessels of gold and silver, bowed to him, and asked, what command do I have? Listen to my command. Accept this girl. Set up a green roof and a wedding stage and take her. If you do not agree to accept her, give up the devotion that he is my teacher and prepare for battle. I give you either of the two for you to choose. What have you got to say? As he heard these words of Parashurama, Gangeya said, I have no relationship with any women other than the glory of victory and the glory of fame. Why do you ask this of me? This is more than a general representation of Bhishma's vow to celibacy that the context warrants. It is the poet's approach to a specific form of life that the courtly world of South India in the 10th century chose to champion. A few lines before the above exchange between Parashurama and Bhishma, we see Amba meeting Salvala. Salvala is Shalva, who had betrothed her in childhood. She appeals to him to accept her as his bride. Salvala refuses, saying, the son of the river, that is Gangeya or Bhishma, carried you away, driving me away in combat. I have become a woman too. Girl, how can women unite with women? Pampa was perhaps the first known poet in South Asia to exploit the effects of sound through and through in a full-length kavya, as if with a resolve, without always confining it to yamaka, of which he was of course a master. This is not to claim that he was the first to use the effects of sound per se for generating rasa. Bharavi and Magha had already shown the effectiveness of this technique. and rhetoricians had recognized the rasa-producing powers of sound before Pampa's time. In the 9th century Dvanyaloka, Anandavardhana has observed that the letters such as the Sha and Sha, Sha for Shankara and Sha for Shanmuga, when combined with Ra and Dha, inhibited the production of Sringara, stating in the auto commentary thereof that these letters are better suited for Bhibaksa. The Dvanyaloka was borrowing from the near contemporary Kavyalankara Sara Sangraha of Udbata, also a work from Kashmir, which had identified the pairing of Sha and Sha with Ra and not only Dha, but all the 5 retroflex, Da, Tha, Da, Da, and Na. This pairing as harsh, Parusha, implying thereby that they are not suitable for Sringara. Pampa seems to have been familiar with Anandavardhana or Udbata or perhaps both. There were occasions when he went a step further than what Anandavardhana had prescribed and tried to eschew Sha, Sha and Dha altogether, retaining Ra alone as the phonology of Dravidian language, in which he wrote, forced this liquid upon his Sringara verses. Consider the 3 consecutive Sringara verses from the legend of Lalitanga in the Aadhi Purana, where not only are the pairing of Sha, Sha and Dha missing, but never once are Sha, Sha and Dha used in describing Sringara. Manimaya Diptiyul Udidu Prajwali Pujwala Kanti Gadiyul. I'll not read the whole stanzas. There are 12 lines where the Sringara Rasa is represented. Only in the last line does Sasha appear in the component Tridasha Loka Sukhamritam. After the flow of Sringara is broken in the previous compound, in the previous samasa, which declares that the hero, Lalitanga, is on the last leg of his life with only 5 Palyopamas more to go. Palyopama is a measure of time. Were there similar directions for Veera Rasa in the Alankara Shastra text? Or was Pampa formulating his own prescriptions? These are questions that we might not be able to answer. What can be said with conviction is that the production of Veera Rasa in the Pampa Bharatam depended on a well-conceived scheme of alliteration. We must now move from the method that Pampa adopted to evoke a rasa to an assessment of the relationship that rasa had with time in this poet's scheme of things. This brings us to the Aadhi Puranam, where the connection between the two emerges with a great measure of clarity. What might have to be inferred from the Pampa Bharatam with some flights of fantasy is laid out in the Aadhi Puranam almost like a declaration. In Pampa's aesthetic, a mood, emotion, or feeling that is a rasa is a faculty of the mind that has its source in action. Love, valor, fury, compassion, these are all products of action that vary in their form and intention. And a proud champion of Jainism that he was, our poet was given to the belief that action is bound to breed karma. An emotion such as Sringara or Veera is then a metaphor for as well as a representation of karma. In the Adi Purana, karma forms the link between rasa and time. The continuity of a rasa, which in the early chapters of the text is Sringara, means that action in the form of lovemaking has kept karma alive. In the Jaina scheme of things, the liberation that comes from Kevala Jnana is the end that a being must aspire for, which is possible only when the karma that is piled up in the course of several births is exhausted. The state of liberation is beyond time and therefore beyond narration and representation. What Pampa narrates in the Adi Puranam is the travails of Adinatha, the first Tirthankara, across several births to live rather recursive lives of accumulating karma through acts of lust before outliving them to empty himself of karma. Time, Kala, is one of the 5 forms, Panchavidham, of worldliness, samsara. The other 4 being matter, dravya, place, kshetra, being, bhava, and imagination, bhava. Adinatha's evolution into a Tirthankara involves a transcending time, but the time that he eventually succeeds in transcending is a seamless continuity of karma through acts of lovemaking in life after life, the Sringara Rasa being its aesthetic index and alliteration, the method for generating this index. The end of action in the form of lovemaking and the resultant end of Sringara is also the end of time. With the end of time, word or sound with its alliterative power to produce rasa must also come to an end. Pampa invokes the Jaina scheme of the progressive Utsarpini and the regressive Avasarpini cycles of time. But unlike the Yuga scheme described in the Mahabharata, which the poet acknowledges, a being in Utsarpini and Avasarpini is not completely at the mercy of time. Individuals are endowed with a great measure of volition, which drives them into action and perpetuates the recursive cycle of karma and breeds the rasa that represents them. It is the same volition that enables them to transcend through the right knowledge the sphere of action and the karma that springs from it to attain liberation. The Pampa Bharatam is the story of the former, a Laukika account of reveling in the action that precipitates Veera Rasa, the Aadhi Puranam, a saga of the latter, an Agamika account of the erasure of karma, action, and rasa. That's Pampa for you. Kannada poets who came after Pampa and followed his model turned out to be mostly Jainas. They explored the relationship between time, action, and rasa with varying degrees of success for close to 2 centuries and a half. In the meantime, in the later half of the 11th century, Shaiva saints in Karnataka began to construct another aesthetic involving a different understanding of human existence. Madara Chennaya, Dohara Kakkaya, and Devara Dasimaya were among the pioneers whose works have survived. They composed short poems in a genre that was originally identified as song, Geetam, but later recognized as Vachana. Saints such as Adaya and Sakalesha Madarasa carried the practice forward in the subsequent decades. It is beyond us to ascertain how the idea of time in these pioneers of the 11th and early 12th century differed from the one in Pampa. There isn't much concerning time in the surviving corpus, and what little exists is not easy to decipher. Look, for instance, at this Vachana, where Devara Dasimaya makes a difference between the past and the present. At least I could not make sense of what Dasimaya was saying. Here's what he says. The people of those times are children of the first nature. The people of these times, children of the nature of life. My sole refuge is the feet of those that know the difference between the first nature and the nature of life, Ramanatha. The production of vachanas snowballed into a vibrant activity between 1150 and 1175 when more than 100 saints, both men and women, composed poems in great numbers. The saints belonged to diverse backgrounds. Some of them, such as Allama Prabhu, Akka Mahadevi, and Siddharama, were renouncers. Most others practiced sainthood even as they followed worldly pursuits without taking to renunciation. Among the saints were Brahmanas, royal officials, soldiers, and people from a wide range of artisanal and service groups, including groups considered untouchable. They inaugurated new literary and religious conventions in the Kannada-speaking region. The literary aesthetic that Pampa had inaugurated in the mid-10th century began to crumble under the weight of the Vachanas, and with Harihara and Raghavanta pioneering new models of kavyas that were full-length hagiographies of the saints, the Jaina model went into oblivion. The Shaivas were participants in the new literary and religious practices. The ones who did this came from the Kalamukha and the Lakulisha or the Pashupata sect. but the most significant among them in terms of numbers and influence were the followers of the Shrotriya or Shuddha Shaiva or simply Shaiva sect, which in Andhra and Tamil Nadu was known as the Maheshwara sect. The Maheshwaras were powerful in the Tamil and Telugu countries, but marginal in Karnataka. Basava's 13th century Telugu hagiographer Palkurike Somanatha called them Veera Maheshwara and called them Veera Shaivas as well as a synonym for Veera Maheshwara. By the 15th century, the saints had come to be designated as Veera Shaivas. The Shaiva saints were heralding a new genre of literary production, although as I told you earlier, these were not identified or conferred recognition as kavyas. They heralded a new approach to asceticism, newer ways of engaging with the question of knowledge, and a new approach to life that involved a critique of power and the rejection of rituals, temple worship, pilgrimage, priesthood, and inequalities based on caste and gender. These aspects were common to all saints who composed vachanas between 1050 and 1200, even though the production of vachanas was not a concerted or centrally overseen project. There were nonetheless wide divergences, not only in the points of emphasis, but also in objects of concern and frames of reference. Existing studies on the vachanas have commented on many of these aspects. What is less appreciated is the fact that the vachanas involved, among other things, an approach to time that was altogether new to the Kannada-speaking region. In one of his vachanas, Allama Prabhu says, in the times when there was no beginning and base, the times when there was no pride and bias, times when there was no form and formlessness, when there was no void and non-void, when the moving and the static weren't made yet. Gogeshwara, that was when your protege arose. Here, Allama represents the Sharana, literally a protege of Shiva, not as an individual, but as an ideal that is irreducible to a being that has facets of individuality. This is a widely pervasive understanding of Sharana as an ideal among the saints, the individual Sharanas being embodiments of the ideal. As an ideal, it is supracorporeal and metaphysical. In this sense, the Sharana is devoid of substances from within and shares no association with substances from without. Appreciating Shiva's proteges in these terms makes the Sharanas as an ideal an immanence. A presence is an immanent presence. We could argue that the immanence here does not translate into omnipresence in relation to time, for the Sharana is said to have a finite beginning that goes back to a time when beginning and base, pride and bias, form and formlessness, void and non-void, and the moving and the static did not exist. We must, however, submit on the basis of another vachana that this is either not the case or that it is a position that Allama rejected later. This is what he says there. The devotee has no existence, for he has no birth, no destruction, for he has no existence. Gogeshwara, your proteges remain eternal, returning to where they came from. The ambiguity noticed here with respect to the question of a beginning is not specific to the two vachanas of Allama, but characteristic of the larger vachana corpus. But there is no ambiguity here because what appears to us as ambiguous is true only within a linear frame of time. The Sharanas did not endorse this linearity as we shall presently see. Time in Allama is not the measurable or recursive time of the phenomenal world, which he barely recognizes, but a thing that originates in the mind as a moment of recognition. Time originates in the mind as a moment of recognition. This moment of perception, experience, and knowledge, involving a nowness and an immediacy of being and time, is the Shaiva saint's basis for time. Time can take on a wide range of forms: linear, cyclical, spiral, narrative, creative, etc., all springing from the acts of the mind in the nowness of imagination or recognition. In Allama's understanding, the moment of awareness occurs as the beginning that gives birth to the Sharana. The times before beginning that he speaks of is the time that unfurls in the mind, a vertical time of the nowness of temporality and not the horizontal time of the past, the present, and the future in an ordered succession. The Sharana is a product of this time. The protege, there's a Vachana that I'm quoting, the protege is born in awareness, is forgetting spent. Can his ways be known? Can his movement be known? Gogeshwara, your protege exists like a child's dream. Within the time that has its source in the mind, the Sharana has a primacy in coming into being over everything else. One of Allama's Vachanas seems to suggest that the Sharana shares an intrinsic relationship with Shiva. Allama says, your bond with the protege is like fire in the stone, like reflection in the water, like a tree in the seed, like silence in the sound, Yogeshwara. In effect, then, the Sharana is an attribute of Shiva. Allama appears to have moved away from this position later, as in another of his Vachana he declares, Yogeshwara is nowhere other than in the devotee's acts of the mind. There are several other Vachanas in which Allama presents Shiva as an aspect of consciousness or Bhava, which we have translated as acts of the mind, but which occur in different contexts in the Vachanas as expressions for conception, imagination, feeling, and determination. You have all these sets of meanings in the Vachanas. Few of the saints share Allama's position that Shiva is a product of Bhava, yet comparable, if not similar sentiments, occur even in the most devout of saints, such as Basava, who observes in a Vachana, will I say the ocean is mighty, it came to rest on the earth. Will I say the earth is mighty, it came to rest on the hood of the Lord of Serpents. Will I say the Lord of Serpents is mighty, it turned into a little ring on Parvati's little finger. Will I say this Parvati is mighty, she became half the body of Parameshwara. Will I say Parameshwara is mighty? He came to rest on the last edge of the mind of the protege of our Kudala Sangha. What this Vachana shares with the first of Allama's Vachanas we have discussed is the primacy that it accords to the Sharana over Shiva, the primacy of the Sharana over the primacy of Shiva. At a practical level, the Vachanas seem to be making a distinction between the protege, Sharana, and the devotee, Bhakta, placing the latter at a lower level in the practitioner's hierarchy. There are many Vachanas, though, where the distinction blurs away, as the Bhakta is used as a synonym for Sharana. Basava generally regards himself as a devotee rather than a protege, but there are times when he seems to fancy himself as a Sharana, scoring over Shiva even in his eternality, which, as it turns out from his oeuvre, is not a sentiment that Basava would otherwise wish to endorse. This is the Vachana. Before Kali's skeleton were made, before the destruction of the three cities, before Vishnu and Brahma were born, before Uma's wedding, before, you were ever young then, I ever old, Kodala Sangama Deva. In developing the idea of the Sharana as an eternal entity, the Shaiva saints also placed this liberated being within time and within the world and not beyond them. This is a Vachana from Allama, which says, this world and the next dwells where the self resides. The sky, Meru and Mandara dwell where the self resides. All worlds dwell where the self resides. The true, the eternal and the blissful forms of Shiva dwells where the self resides. Beyond the north and the four quarters dwell where the self resides. The sun, the moon and the firmament of stars dwell where the self resides. The distance and the great distances dwell where the self resides. Yogeshwara Linga with its own ways dwells where the self resides. In this departure from Pampa's understanding, the liberated being has a place within time and within the world, even while being untouched by worldliness. There are repeated allusions in Allama to the effect that springs from the mind. The moment of recognition is the moment when time emerges. This is what he says in one of the vachanas. The form in the mirror has the mirror alone for creation, sustenance, and destruction. Why is the nature of the human world not there, my friend? What's the creation, sustenance, and destruction in this world bound by karma, my friend? Look, one's ways don't occur in the other. The true devotee in the visible hands of a guru has creation, sustenance, and destruction verily here. What ways of karma is this? Not any other way, it's the linga's way that Gogeshwara made. It is not easy to characterize in categorical terms this moment of recognition as an aspect of knowledge, awareness, or consciousness. The vachanas do not give us a coherent statement with which to reflect upon this question. The moment of recognition is the moment when time flashes forth or reflects in the mind. The mirror is the metaphor here. The reflection in the mirror, the creation, sustenance, and destruction of form seen in the mirror, is an aspect of the mirror. There is a real world, and the reflection we know is contingent upon the real world. It is true that the reality of the world in Allama is conceptual and not corporal. It is Bhava that is reflecting Bhava. But the reflection is not an aspect of the real world, it is an aspect of the mirror. We have here an endorsement of the nowness of existence in terms of bhava, which rejects karma, by which I mean Allama declares in so many words that the endorsement of the nowness, which rejects karma, admit of time as an aspect of the mind in the moment of existence, with recognition as its source, just as reflection is in relation to mirror. There is enough material in the vachanas for us to debate whether the aspect of the mind here is knowledge, involving methodical reflections, or awareness, involving an intuitive understanding of the state of affairs coming from one's place and experience in the world, or consciousness involving unmediated cognition. And there are enough ambiguities in the vachanas to argue in favor of all three positions. What cannot be debated is the understanding of time as a product of bhava, an act of the mind. The idea of time in the Shaiva saint's understanding stands in contradistinction to the one in Pampa's Jaina model, where knowledge brings time to an end and transforms the being into an entity beyond time. The here and now of the Shaiva saints was in this line of thinking, the place and the moment for realization and liberation. A being was not condemned to wait until karma ceased to be and time brought him to the afterworld. Liberation possible just imagination. Absorbed worldliness or some not self. The reflection in the mirror, contingent on the remain untouched by it. Samsara is a relationship mirror. Of worldliness, here is what Bhava has to say. My worldliness bear the thoughts, wondering what has to store for us, what has tomorrow in store for us. There is a revulsion having appeared many a
Hello, Manu. Manu.
Is it, I'm afraid there seems to be a problem.
Yeah.
Hello? Anyway, it was a great presentation. I have a lot of questions, one actually, but let Suchandra sum up. But I think he didn't finish, did he?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
No,
Let me
he's
call him.
because he's supposed to talk on Sabarimala also, he said.
Connection
So
is
I think,
disrupted.
yeah.
He just
Connect.
went off. He went off air. Hello.
Yeah, we can't get, yeah, Manu is there, but he's unmuted. He's muted, sorry.
Ask him to come back.
I can see him, see his name, but he's
Could
muted.
be his phone might be acting up. You know, phones are always notoriously
Within
difficult.
the time is more emphatically
Yeah,
underlined.
So he's back,
Don't
he's back.
Great.
don't say then, now, and yet another. This is the day for the one that says Shiva is the refuge. This is the day for the one that says Hara is the refuge. This is the day for the one that remembers Udala Sangha ceaselessly. There's another of Basava's Vachana here. Is the divine world different from the mortal world? Within this world are endless worlds. Shiva's world is where there's service for Shiva, my Lord. The divine world is where Shiva's devotees dwell. The devotee's courtyard is Varanasi, his body is Kailasa. This is true, Kudala Sangama Deva. Allama, on the other hand, distinguishes the divine world Devaloka and the mortal world Martyaloka by reserving the latter for the worldly and the former for the divine being. O man with a body, instant born and dying in no time, tell me, when will you be known as God? Tell me, what's the difference between God and the dying, were God to die? The divine world is for the gods, the human world for humans. Gopeshwar Allayya has no other world. There is no physical separation between the divine and the mortal worlds here as it appears at the outset. It is a conceptual difference springing from the presence or absence of divinity. The sacredness of the Sharana makes him or her a being that dwells in the divine world, which has a conceptual presence arising from the mind, is very much a world within time in the way in which the saints imagined it. For time also has its source in the mind, in the imagination of the Shaiva saints. We must then say, going back to the metaphor of the mirror, that the world reflects as a divine or mortal on the manner in which it is conceptualized, on the manner in which it occurs in the bhava. Hence it is that the saints insist on the purity, shuddhi, of the bhava. I now come to the last segment of this lecture. In rejecting Pampa's Jaina view of action as the source of time, and replacing it with the view that time springs from the act of recognition in the mind, the Shaiva saints laid the foundations for a new way of life that crystallized by the 15th century into Veerashaivism. Here, the liberated being is within time and therefore capable of devouring rasa. The action behind rasa does not breed karma, for the action unfolds in the mind like the reflection in the mirror. And for this reason, there is no corporality involved in it. It is not the physical action of the real world, for its physicality does not have the corporality of the real world, but has a different nature altogether, for which the reflection seen in the mirror serves as a metaphor. Says Basava in a Vachana that invokes Sambhoga Sringara, where lovemaking is physical as in a piece of reflection, but not corporal. This is what he says. To look at you is endless bliss. To make love with you is bliss supreme. I was looking, the 80 million strands of hair turned into eyes. Udala Sangamadeva, my lord, looking at you on and on, there arose in my mind the craving for sex, and my digits sprang into life. The nowness that the Vachana spoke for was invested with sacredness because it was a moment in which liberation was possible. It was also the moment in which the liberated Sharana lived. This approach to time brought lasting changes in religious traditions in Karnataka. As in the Jaina scheme, the liberated being was a sacred being, but unlike the Jainas, liberation for the Shaiva saints occurred here and now, and not upon the cessation of time. The presence of the sacred Sharana in the world made the world sacred, as it were. What was sacred had to be shorn of pollution. This was an inevitable corollary. And reasonably enough, The word or the sound, which in Pampa's work, as we saw, conjured up a world of emotions, a world of rasa, was in the vachanas the vehicle for transmitting the new knowledge of the sacred that they embodied. There was, in addition to it, a self-representation of the word or the sound as the divine itself, untouched by pollution. Says Allama, sound is polluted, they say. Does sound have pollution beyond one's suspicions? Does dust ever stick to the winds? Goggeshwara Linga isn't of that trait, O Sangana Basavanna. And again, the spoken word is the luminous linga. This is a famous vachana of Allama, Matembudu, Jyotirlinga. The spoken word is the luminous linga. Voice is the supreme core of the self. The palate-lip complex of the proteges are beyond sound, peck and trace. Listen, dear fool, the proteges of Goggeshwara are not polluters when they speak. Pollution was a revulsive idea for the Shaiva saints. It provoked reactions ranging from disapprovals expressed in the vachanas of several saints to the mass feeding events that Basava organized, in which commensality was the norm. The intensity of this sentiment can hardly be overstated. In the vachanas, over half of the 130 odd saints of the 11th and 12th centuries disavowed pollution in one form or the other. The word sutaka, pollution, is used in the vachanas only to condemn the idea. It occurs more than 500 times in the extant corpus, of which 41 are in the vachanas of Basava, 50 in Allama, 60 in Madara Dhulaya, and 116 in Channa Basava. Other expressions used widely with a reproachful tone include hole, impure, and sutaki, the polluter. The rejection of pollution in the vachanas was of great historical consequence to the Kannada-speaking region. The Veerashaivas, who inherited the vachanas, disavowed the caste system, which had pollution as one of its bases. They rejected pilgrimage and temple worship, as all places were equally sacred in the order of things that the vachanas represented. As Basava has said, there is but one land for the scavenger's street and for the shrine of Shiva. And the dismissed priesthood, as it was enjoined upon every devotee to perform his or her own worship. The rejection of caste, pilgrimage, temple worship, and priesthood occurred more in words and less in deeds. As with all conventions that come into being when revolutions come to pass, things that the vachanas had rejected came to be practiced with great devotion and fanfare, even by saints who claimed the legacies of the 12th century pioneers. Yet, there was one sphere of life where the ideal was honored in the observance and not in the breach: pollution in women. It is for this reason that Veerashaiva women in Karnataka have historically not observed pollution during menstruation and childbirth. Nothing can be said of it with certainty for times before the last decades of the 19th century, but in the last 150 years, menstruating women among Veerashaivas have worked at the fields and in their homes, cooked food for themselves and for others, and offered worship, although the ones given to pilgrimage and temple visit refrained from them at such times. The absence of pollution was liberating in its own ways, even if this was not the liberation that the saints had spoken of in the 12th century. But then, strange are the ways of time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, such a fascinating journey and such a fascinating narrative. Thank you so much, Manu, Dr. Manu Devadevan. We have been transported to a completely different.
Let me try to come back for a moment with the video. What's yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Please affiliate with the disturbance, and I'll stop the video.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that wonderful narrative, wonderful journey which we had through your the evocative speeches, lectures, and we are just transported into a different kind of world. And I know already Anindita is just waiting to ask you a lot of questions, and she has a lot of questions in her mind. And I think there are many others will have a lot of comments and questions. I was just reminded when you were speaking of Allama's, that portion of a lecture, I was reminded of Professor Vijay Ramaswamy's review of your book, translation on the book on Allamas. And she was so passionate in her review, and the way she's no more with us, but I was remembering the way she reviewed, and she said like how Shiva Prakash, she was talking about you and Shiva Prakash and the way. So thank you very much. And another thing, since I study a little bit of inscription, so I was also, when you talked about Pampa Bharati and his love for Bharavi and Kalidasa, I was reminded of Ravi Kirti. So these are the things that you bring, Ravi Kirti comparing himself with Bharavi and Kalidasa. So the space is the same. So this and Jaina, both Jaina. So these are evocative of some kind of a tradition, continuing of tradition, something like that. Like this struck me. So now it is open, and I request Anindita to have her. The first question will be from Anindita.
Thank you, Manu. That was really wonderful. You know, I'm so fascinated by the complexity of medieval times in the way it sort of imagines time. All right, so I found it absolutely fascinating. My question to you is, because if I've got you right, there is in the mind of the knowledgeable one, right? In the mind of the knowing Sharana, right? Okay. There is only the present, only the present. There is, as you've so beautifully put it, there is a nowness. Now, I am kind of looking at time from a Western philosophical perspective. And the Western philosophical perspective looks at time as the essence of human being, because it actually, as you had mentioned at one point, it is linear, right? Okay, so there is always a very important moment of memory, right? A human being becomes a being when there is memory, right, as its as its understanding. So it always looks at the self through the mirror of memory, right? Okay, so without an understanding of memory, it is difficult for the self to contemplate the self, right? Okay, so memory in itself predicates history, right? It stands on history. So in that sense, time and history are rather essential philosophical components of a Western of a Western intellectual tradition. This is how I have understood it. Okay, as far as I have been reading Heidegger and Dewey, and history seems to be a philosophical base of the self. Now, what I really found interesting, if I've understood that right, my question then comes to the emphasis on the present, because present doesn't have a memory. Neither does it have a future, neither does it have a past. And yet the self is so powerful that it can, absorb Mother Goddess who becomes a ring on the, Sheshanaga becomes a ring on the, and then Mother Goddess becomes, another attribute of Shiva, and Shiva becomes the what shall I say, a deep part of the self, right? So actually the entire cosmos folds back into the self, right? And this is a nowness which is huge, right? And I find it, so have I got you right? Is this what you're saying? Which is fascinating, wonderful, and scary. Yeah.
Scary.
Scary. The nowness is really, yeah. Yes, would you answer, or you take other questions together?
Well, what is interesting for me is that when we look at the Vachana corpus, there is so little of memory in it. There's so little of the past. All we find are the names of a few Shaivite saints from the past, and on one occasion they are identified as the Puratanas, and the Puratanas refer to the 63 Nayanar saints of Tamil Nadu. And there are references to a few others, Kalidasa, someone called Manu, then there is Ohila, Udbata, mostly Shaiva saints. And it's as if they're trying to start a lineage and associate themselves with that lineage. But there is no sense of either time existing as past and present. There is a famous Vachana of Allama in which he says, Indana Anantavanu, Undana Anantavanu, Indina Dina Olagondittu. The endlessness in the past and the endlessness of the future, the endlessness to come, were all embodied or encapsulated in the now, in the present. So the idea of memory actually becomes very strong and very powerful in Veerashaivism after Harihara and Raghavanka start narrativizing it. Because there's a strong anti-narrative content as well in the Vachanas, which doesn't enable them to produce narratives. In fact, there are places where they replicate narratives as well. But with Harihara, around 1175 or so, he starts producing a genre of hagiography called Ragales, in which he tells us the stories of the 63, the Nayanars of Tamil Nadu, a few saints of Andhra, and many of the saints from Karnataka, Vasava, Akkamahadevi. So that is the point where memory becomes very important in that tradition. The people themselves who are involved in the production of vachanas did not have that kind of thing. Although they used to speak about memory in terms of remembering and forgetting. But that, Arivu, Maravu, as one is remembering, the other is forgetting. But here, what you remember and what you forget is the deity, not really a past or a memory that you would like to recall.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes. I'm thinking,
you have,
maybe can I just come back on the chat? Please let others ask questions, but
okay,
come back on the chat.
Sure, I'll come back to you after a few questions. Yes, the next, Aloka, would you like to have?
There's a question by Rajesh, maybe first.
Rajesh, yeah, Rajesh, please.
There's a question in the chat, which
Rajesh. Sorry, I didn't get it. Yeah, Rajesh, can you go on, or shall I read the question? Yeah, so I'm reading it. Control of time, it is M. Rajesh, our colleague. Control of time leads to control of society, and these new temporalities also produce new subjectivities. In what ways did these new temporalities hit a deadlock regarding the emancipatory potential of the vachanas? Did these new ideas of time also influence and change ideas of death? And how was the received understanding of death in the practices of the people in all strata? Do we have any examples of practitioners who are cognitive dissonance of experience time, as in the case of the holy madman? Manu, did you get the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me just respond to the question on death that he referred to. It's very interesting to note that in some of the Vachanakaras, particularly Basava, they would celebrate death as a kind of great event. There's a famous Vachana where Basava says, Maranave Mahanavami. Death is the Mahanavami. So you have to be prepared for that. But it's a moment to be celebrated. Again, it is not something in the future. Just as they do not have a past, they also do not have a future. So the moment of death is a moment to be celebrated there. The other point in the question was whether this brought lasting changes. I'm quite skeptical on the extent of changes because, of course, it initiated new monastic traditions in Karnataka. It produced fascinating literature, particularly in the 15th and 16th century. After the 1420s, when in the court of Devaraya II, most of these vachanas were compiled and narrativized, that is put together in the forms of narrative anthology. But many of the ideas in the vachanas themselves, for example, the critique of caste that occurs here and there, and the idea of pollution as far as lower castes are concerned, most of them, I guess, were never put into practice. As I told you towards the end of the talk, it's only as far as women is concerned, pollution in women is concerned, that it was absorbed. No, it was not in the breach, but in the observance that that the ideal was honored. Otherwise, of course, the Vachanas produced great literature subsequently. Great institutions were built. They were inspirations for state formation. Once rulers such as the Geladi Nayakas come to power, so that way historically there is a significance. But if the Vachanas have a message, and if you would like to know if the message itself transformed Karnataka in big ways, I would say it was limited to pollution in women. Most other things, came to be practiced with great gusto and fanfare in later times.
Yes, Professor Pasha.
Yeah. So thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. And I mean, I found your comparison between the earlier period of Pampa with the Vachanas very interesting in the way they looked at history, quote unquote history, right? And one of the things, I mean, just what you just responded to, Rajesh, let me just first mention that, you see, of course, there is the focus on the self and emancipation of the self in the latter. But, there is this, all over South India, there is this question of the appropriation of this ideology, if one can say, by a state or different levels of the state, because obviously the Vachanas are addressing a community. I mean, initially addressing a community of people, however you define community in specific localities. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I mean, there are hagiographies that come up, and also there is a kind of a progression in the way in which notions of time within this Vachana tradition also evolve. But what is very interesting is that in the previous period, when you are talking about the Rasa, the Veera Rasa, and of course, sorry, just to go back to the Vachanas, as you in response to Anindita also said, is about the nowness, about the contemporary, the present, right? I would suggest that even in Pampa, even in the earlier period, the emphasis on the Veera Rasa is also about the contemporary, the present, because you very ably, very fascinatingly connected the question of the predominance of the Veera Rasa by not an actual ditto comparison with the heroes of the Mahabharata, of Arakesari and all that, but that the emphasis on the Veera Rasa is about the contemporariness of action, of what is happening. And therefore, the space that Pampa is addressing, of course, an ideological space where Jainism, of course, is a predominant faith and all that, and also the faith that was Chalukyas of Kalyani, for example, are Jains, right? And so he's addressing a populace, he's addressing the court, and he's addressing a particular audience, which may not be people at large, but a very select courtly group, or a little extended various levels of state power and so on and so forth. So the two examples are addressing two different readers or listeners. And therefore this Veera Rasa is also very much about the contemporary. And for the Veera Rasa to become effective, they must go back to time, because this is a way of looking at our notion of time, because nothing in the present, especially political achievements and so on and so forth, will be meaningless unless and until you relate it to the past, right? There's no such thing as a vacuum of presentness. I mean, it has to be in relation to what greatness has happened in the past. But there are attempts in Pampa to try and, sort of lessen the actual relationship, because I think he's a very fascinating writer who's trying to regionalize whatever thoughts and ideas that he's drawing upon from the Itihas Puran tradition. And in that sense, I think that you will agree that almost all the Chalukyan Prashastis is written in a similar vein, wherein questions of valor, but also of greatness, physical strength, etc., are emphasized by these Prashasti sections of all, I mean, the Vengi Chalukyas, the Badami Chalukyas, and everywhere. And they are in a very interesting way linking themselves, their identities, to a legendary and then to a mythic past. Whereas Pampa is trying to lessen that by emphasizing the importance of the present. I don't know whether you'll agree with that. So I think that notions of time and history and historical consciousness are some things that Pampa has to handle consciously because of his present and the larger context in which he's operating as a faithful Jain. Whereas the Vachanas, of course, are addressing a larger audience, I would say, and therefore they're trying to not address particularly the notions of history, but their notions of the way in which their own emancipation of as bhaktas and so on and so forth is linked to a larger cosmic world. So that would be my reactions. I don't know whether you'd like to respond to that or whether I've sort of got what you've said properly or not. Thank you.
Yes. Manu, please.
I would actually agree that Pampa is also about the present. It's mostly about the present because he's trying to produce a prashasti of his own patron. He's trying to sing praise of his patron by equating Harikesari with Arjuna. But what is also interesting for me, and perhaps a point that I did not touch upon in this lecture, was the relationship which Pampa had with the state and how it differed from the relationship the Vachanakaras themselves might have had with the state. Basava
That
himself
was actually my question, yeah.
Yeah, but Basava was in the court just like Pampa, and both of them, Harikesari II and Vijjala were both Samantas. Vijjala eventually becomes the king as well. But most of the Vachana poets, be it Basava was very critical of the political establishment of his times. There is one Vachana where he says that if a hunter brings the corpse of a corpse or meat of a rabbit, you'll buy it for whatever price it is, but if the hunter brings the dead body of the king, are you going to buy it? Nobody would even it's so repulsive that you wouldn't care for it. So less the life of a king or life of a human being is worse than the life of a small animal. Another poet, another Vachanakara who would share the sentiment is Siddharama. Siddharama was invited by both the Sevunas of the Yadavas of Devagiri as well as the Kalachuris of Mangalaveda. He was somewhat favorably disposed towards the Yadavas. Of course, he did not accept their patronage, but he was deeply critical of the Kalachuris of Mangalaveda. The first hagiographer, Harihara, was in the Hoysala court. He had problems with the court. He leaves the court. He leaves Dwara Samudram and he goes to Hampi. And then the first major hagiographer of Basava in Telugu, Palkurike Somanatha's relationship with the state, with the king Prataparudra, does not seem to have been very, it was not hostile outrightly, but it was not a very healthy relationship. So you find in the Vachanakaras an attitude towards the state which is very different from the attitude that Pampa might have had. So that I think explains. So once you're in a court and you're trying to sing praise of your patron, and you're also a Jaina, then it becomes pertinent that you pick up on some of the Jaina themes as well, because most of the Jaina writers, be it Nemi Chandra or be it your Jinasena, they would say that they would argue when they produce the kavyas on the 63 Shalaka Purushas that all these were narrated by the first Ganadhara, Gautama Ganadhara. And we are only, since those were lost, we are only trying to reconstruct them, or if they were in oral tradition, we are putting them into writing. But there is an index in the past in relation to into which your identity is intertwined. Pampa is more or less doing the same thing, borrowing upon Jaina ideas, but doing it with the help of the Mahabharata. So I think the question of state needs to be posed a little more seriously to see this difference. But otherwise, Pampa is not speaking about the past. Pampa is actually speaking about the present, as Professor Ravi says.
Yeah, and I just very briefly suggest that maybe in the early vachanas, as we have with the Nayanars and others also, that there is a kind of antagonistic, not an antagonistic, but a kind of a questioning relationship with the state. Whereas when you come to these court poets like Pampa and others, they must necessarily be located within the parameters of supporting their patrons within the state. So obviously they are dealing with two very different locations when we are looking at the notions of time. So that therefore, obviously, as you rightly pointed out, it's, I mean, though they are individuals writing, but their context in which they are writing is of course different. But I think I still would like to emphasize that though Pampa is concerned about the present, he has very ably and deftly looked at the past in terms of incorporating from the Mahabharata. And in that sense, the patron is also located within a larger scape. It's not only the Kannada words, of course, that's there. It's not only the Kannada regional context, but there's also kind of connectedness to a larger, Indian or subcontinental kind of ethos by bringing in that element of the mythic and the legendary within his narrative. So I would suggest that Pampa has a complicated notion of historical consciousness because he's bringing in the notions of time that are available to him within the Jain philosophical traditions and then trying to connect it to the real time of his contemporary location, his real time. His real time is that of Arikeshari. And therefore, he has to somehow or the other place Arikeshari in a larger context of time. That's what my broader point was. So he's a fantastic scholar who is sort of trying to encompass both his ideological position as well as the notion of his locatedness within the court.
Yeah.
I won't go on anymore.
Yeah. Actually, it's a similar type of experiment was done in Bengal in a later time. If you look at the Ramacharita, there also you have the contemporary and the past, looking at Rama and the past. I have one question in the chat, and then I will go back to Anindita. She has another question. So this is from Tarakeshwar VV. Any composition of linguistic fact? Sorry.
Tarakeshwar,
Yeah.
Tarakeshwar is a Kannada specialist. He teaches at YouTube.
Okay.
Tarakeshwar.
Where is he?
No,
Shall I read?
He has already asked the question by chat.
So shall I read the question? Shall I read the question, or he will ask himself?
No, he says this is not a question, it's a comment.
Oh, it's a comment, but I have to read I'll read the comment then.
Please.
Yeah, any composition of linguistic fact text literature would bear the marks of the time in which it gets composed. This nounness, now within quotes, of a text or linguistic fact is different from the way they would imagine the being in relation to time, history. So if Manu wants to react to this comment, or then we can go, or we'll go to Anindita's question. Manu, would you like
about
to?
Contextualizing, I would agree with that.
Okay. So I think, Anindita, you wanted to ask another question?
Actually, Professor Aluka had a talk and she was looking at the Puranic notion of memory in her previous talk. And today there is this tension between the present continuous, as it were, and a connection of a perceived past which does not deal with the everyday past, which does not deal with the with a normal passage of memory, but there is the privileging of memory with a capital M. And therefore it seems to me, and this is I remember asking Professor Aluka about her take on time and on mythic memory, and different notions of cyclical time. And today Manu also mentioned, in fact, he added another twist. He said that there is vertical time, horizontal time, and a
spiral time.
Yeah. So, and then there is narrative, right? So we are, well, you know, time can be broken up into infinite, I suppose infinite categories, because human beings would play around with various ways of being in this very strange take on time. But I somehow feel that the very notion of memory is not in the way we moderns understand memory, right? You know, in a everyday sense. And therefore, perhaps, I mean, I would like to have Professor Aloka, because Pampa is also looking at memory, right? He's also trying to connect his quote, his king's quote, back to Mahabharata, right? You know, so there is a constantly this scalar change of the everyday into the mythic, right? You know, it's a very deliberate playing around with something which is larger than life, right? You know, so I would like to have a little bit more light thrown on why the everyday was seen to be mundane, and different epic notions of history seen as giant footprints which human cultures would like to lug in when like you also mentioned Ramcharitmanas. This seems to be a fairly
not Ramcharitmanas, Ramacharita of Sanskrit.
Yes, sorry. Well, Tulsi, yeah. So you do have all regions coming back with, you know, it is not just Pampa, it is not just Tulsidas, it is not just, you know, it is actually an Indic feature of understanding memory, right? And I would like to have both your comments on it, both Manu and Aloka's comment on this.
Yes.
Well, then it's very interesting that you refer to the mundaneness of the present. So I've not thought about it, but I'm thinking loudly now. Perhaps it's not a mundaneness that Pampa is referring to by not speaking at length about his patron himself. It may perhaps be the other way around. You know, there is already a legacy of at least 700 or 800 years of the Mahabharata circulating in Karnataka before his time, and it has produced texts such as the Kirata Arjuniyam, and it has also produced a large number of plays, perhaps. And the Jaina epic also, you know, at least from the 6th century onwards, you have Jaina epics being produced in substantial numbers. And Jinasena first, Jinasena second, in fact, is another interesting character, because Jinasena the first produces the Harivamsha, in which the Jaina legend is actually brought into the Mahabharata. So there's a story of Arjuna and Krishna. So it becomes a Jaina epic of sorts. So I think it's more of a kind of ennobling the present by transforming the present into the past, rather than looking at the present as mundane. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking loudly. No, that's my impression. No?
If you want me to respond, then it's very interesting that Manu mentions the Kirata Arjunam, but I think he will agree, and everybody knows that the way in which the Kirata Arjunam plays on the Arjuna Kirata story is very different from the way it is played upon in the Mahabharata, that is in the original. The Kirata becomes more important in the context of the Kirata Arjunam, and therefore the struggle between the Kirata and Arjuna is the victory of the Kirata. In that sense, you know, the question of the self-identity of the region and the author's concern with his present and his location. Okay, so now why is it that these in different regional contexts, why is it that there is a kind of a drawing upon whatever you want to call it, the Itihas Puran tradition, the epic, or the memory, the collective memory of grand narratives of a kind? I think that a part of it is to sort of distance oneself away from other competing other competing rulers of the particular region, and therefore associating them with a tradition which they draw upon. They don't necessarily become that. They just draw upon that. What they become is how Pampa has created the identity within the frame of the Jain tradition. And I have a very interesting example from Andhra Pradesh in the Vajrakarur taluk of in Karnool district. There is a taluk where you have a lot of Jain caves, and over there, when they did the village-to-village surveys, they found a inscription. They found not only an inscription, they actually found a visual representation of Jambu Dvipa. So obviously the Jains also have an idea of Jambu Dvipa, and I think Manu also mentioned that that Pampa visualized that the Mahabharata that he is retelling is a Jain text, right? Okay, so there is an ideological overlayering, there is a spatial overlayering, and then there is a linguistic overlayering. I think all these things are happening in particular locations in different parts of the country. And why are they going back to a mythic and this, what you call the Indic sensibilities, is because that defines their identities, right? It's just not the temporality of the present. It's a totality that has to be identified. So you distance yourself from your competitors. At the same time, you link yourself up with something that is unrelated to you. It's totally, in actual reality, it is unrelated to you, right? But you need to access that so as to give yourself an identity which is different from the others. So Manu really rightly pointed out that in the earlier examples, it's the question of looking at how to handle the other. So the predominance of the Veera Rasa. And in the latter, it is how do we understand ourselves? We are born in this here. We are not born elsewhere. We are born in the locality, in the region, and we are born out of a community that is seeking a kind of a universal liberation, or whatever you want to call it. So there's Bhava there and there's Rasa here. And both these things, I think he's brought this out very well. And I think the why Pampa is so important is that he sort of so deftly brings these three forces together. The contemporaneousness of his present, his understanding of the past, linking to a kind of an Itihasic Puranic mentality, and then his affiliation to the Jain faith. Whereas this is not something that the Vachanas have to handle. But as he also pointed out in response to Rajesh, that later on the Vachanas and the appropriation of these Vachanas in historical time gives a kind of hagiography and a narrativization of these Vachana traditions. So I don't know whether Manu wants to only address this in a literary linguistic context, or does he want to bring in the notion of time and the way in which time is addressed in all this? Because I think much of his reading is more there's a literary and linguistic twist to what he's saying than I think that's what I think. I don't know. Maybe he can clarify.
I'm sure Manu would respond to that. Yeah, Manu, please.
Well, this particular piece is not as historical, because some of my other writings, they have so much to quote from the inscriptions and land grants and the formation. So that way, this is much more closely dealing with the text itself. What is also interesting for me, the point that Professor Aloka made of going back to the past as a method of, as a mode of, or as a means of distinguishing one's own identity. That I think is very important. Because I've been looking at the Puri Jagannath temple, the narratives that were produced there in say roughly the 14th century. That is the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya of the Skanda Purana. There, the story is happened. The present almost does not figure there. The whole narrative happens in the Krita Yuga. And there is no reference there at all to any of the contemporary ruling dynasties or states within Odisha itself. Although hardly 50, 60, 70 years before this text was produced, Ananga Bhima III would go to the extent of replacing Purushottama and Lakshmi with the trinity that you have now, Jagannath, Balabhadra, and Subhadra. in less than three quarters of a century, you have a narrative in which there is no Chodaganga, there is no Ananga Bhima, no Yayati. All of these are important in the temple chronicles of a later period, the Madala Panji. But the story is set in the Krita Yuga, where a king who's not a local king, this is Indradyumna from Avanti, he comes here and he's the one who establishes or rebuilds the temple, but he fails to establish a relationship with the region itself, with Odisha itself. And one fine day when the temple is more or less ready, Narada comes to him and says, this is one of the most, I have never seen such a fascinating temple. So when you're installing a deity, make sure that the best one in the universe, that is Brahma himself, comes to install the deity here. Now Ananga Bhima agrees, and both of them, Narada and Ananga Bhima, not Ananga Bhima, Indradyumna, they go to Brahma Loka. They are there for a few minutes, and Brahma agrees, and then they come back. Brahma agrees to come to the earth and install the images. But 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes in Brahma Loka is equivalent to several Manvantaras on earth. So by the time he comes back, he's not able to recognize the world around him. The temple is very much there, but his lineage, his dynasty has gone. Another dynasty has taken over. That Manvantara, the first Manvantara of Vaivasvata Manu is over. You have the second Manvantara running now. So that's a very fascinating way in which the compilers of the Skanda Purana perhaps identified time, and through that identification of a time, tried to establish the priestly power of the pandas in the temple themselves, vis-a-vis or in opposition to the state, which is the Suryavamshi Gajapati state. I'm trying to read this on the lines of two very interesting papers which Ganeन्द्ranath Das had written very, very, very long ago. This is in the 1978 anthology, the cult of Jagannath and the regional tradition of Odisha. So there he's discussing the evolution of priestly powers under the Gangas and the Eastern Gangas and the Suryavamshi Gajapatis. So locating the whole thing there, we would actually see how the temple, the priest community in the temple is appropriating more and more land, more and more legend, tradition, power to itself, to the detriment of the state. And towards the end of the Eastern Ganga period, you have the priests coming into a direct encounter, a face-to-face encounter with the state in the clash with what's his name? I forget his name. He's one of the last Bhanugupta. So that is very interesting for me. So in the present paper, in this paper, I have not tried to locate it in that fashion. Who are the actors actually involved there and what their interests were. But as it happens in Puri, by the 16th century, the king is almost reduced to the most important landlord. And he's also the Adya Sevaka, he's appropriated into the temple. So the image of the king has been transformed into the image of a priest of sorts. I don't know if such an exercise is possible for Pampa, for instance, because we don't have so much of material, but it's a line worth pursuing.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I'll put up my hand.
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
Mr.
Thank you.
Tarakeshwar. Yeah.
This is about looking at Pampa Bharata or Vikramarjuna Vijaya as a Jaina text. Pampa himself wouldn't look at it as a Jaina text. He makes a distinction between Aadhi Purana and Vikramarjuna Vijaya. For him, Vikramarjuna Vijaya is a Laukika Kavya, and Aadhi Purana is a
Not really,
Nagama.
because Pampa himself says at the end of every Ashwasa that this is the Mahabharata is Jina Padamboja Vara Prasadotpanna. Every chapter of the Pampa Bharata ends with that.
Is it just a salutation? Is just a salutation to the deity, or does it affect the content of the narration too? Is a question that we need to look at.
The content is mostly drawn from the Mahabharata, but he's already made the Mahabharata a Jaina text because he had an example in front of him. The Harivamsha Purana of Jinasena the first, not Jinasena the second, who wrote the Purva Purana, the senior Jinasena. So he had transformed the Mahabharata into a completely Jaina text, mostly focusing on Krishna, the character of Krishna. He does not refer to that text per se, but you have that precedent very much there. And Jinasena the first as well as Jinasena the second were very important presences in the Rashtrakutas. And Pampa also lived in the Rashtrakuta times. So I think that must have been there in his mind when he was writing these lines.
Okay, the point that I was trying to make was any text will have the author and the author's ideology might play a role in the way they're re-narrating a text. But apart from that, the context also makes a impinges on the text. So one is the quote unquote ideology of the author and the context in which it is being written. Both do play a role. The point that I was trying to make here, I think, was that the memory or whatever the narratives that exist earlier is brought to bear on the present to make sense of the present, or the present, in the context of the present, you make sense of the past. So both are happening at the same time in these rewritings or narratives. I think that's the point that I was trying to make. We can't simply say it as a Jaina text too. It's a kind of different forces are pulling this particular text in different directions at that point of time. I hope I made some sense.
I think that's a very important point, Tarakeshwar. The way in which the contemporary present of Pampa is trying to understand its past in the midst of an ideological context all over the Deccan, particularly in the regions of the Rashtrakutas and the Chalukyas, where Jainism was a very important faith. And therefore, this question of trying to create a sense of how to understand the other in the midst of all these, ideological as well as linguistic as well as other changes that are happening in his contemporary present. We may not say, as Manu is saying, we may not say that he's addressing the Mahabharat as the original so-called Mahabharat. Maybe he's looking at it as a Jain Mahabharat. That is a possibility because there are antecedents for that. There are different ways in which these epics have been looked at in the Buddhist and the Jain traditions. But I think that this is a fantastic experimentation in the way in which it's not hybridity or anything like that. It is a very clear understanding of our present, but in relationship to antecedents or narratives of the past. But we don't want to borrow them lock, stock, and barrel. There is agency with us to give it a color. And that giving it that color, a linguistic as well as ideological color in the way he does, is very significant. And that's how I would read Pampa as not either or. Adi, both the texts would be within that phase, that experiment that he's doing, right? In one, he's trying to handle, the complexity of other traditions alongside. In the other, he's more confident in just narrating it within the Jina understandings of time, cosmic time, and so on and so forth. I think these are very exciting times. And there were different, by the way, in the Deccan, at this point in time, there was the emergence of various Jain monastic orders that were so-called, I wouldn't say, that were kind of radical in the sense that they were slightly different from the way in which the other Jain monastic orders were. And this culminates in Shravana Belgola and so on and so forth with the Mula Sangha, the very, very militant Sangha of the Jains and all that. But there is a very strong layer of the Jain understanding of notions of time. Like this, I told you about this Jambu Dvipa at Konakondala in the Vajrakarur Taluk. What were the Jains doing over there? In this, now if you go to this area, it's like barren land over there. But they were very much present. Vajrakarur, this was the diamond mining areas of the Deccan and so on and so forth. They were very much there. So a very deep-seated Jain presence in many parts of the Deccan at this point in time. So either or, though I agree with you partially, but there's no either or. There is a kind of a negotiation. A continuous state of negotiation is what I will call it. I don't want to take up so much.
Thank you very much. We have a question from our friend Malini, Malini Adiga. Manu, she has posted, actually, she was in YouTube. Would you say the Sharanas traced their lineage from the Nayanars or from the Kalamukhas? Also, I have always felt that Pampa's style of panegyric influenced epigraphic Prashastis in terms of the epithets and attributes used for kings. Do you think so too? That's from Malini. And Mr. Tarakeshwar, I think you had something to say. You can take up that later on after Manu responds.
Yeah, to the second question of Dr. Adiga, yes, Pampa's influence can be seen in, say, for example, the 11th and 12th century inscriptions of, say, the Ballari district or parts of the Gadag district in a big way. There's a small chief, someone called Immadi Bhaira Rasa, and he produces an inscription in which there is a description of the locality over which he is ruling. This is the locality of Koguli. This more or less resembles or mirrors the kind of description that Pampa makes of Banavasi. Pampa himself was influenced by a lot of epigraphic, Prashastis, but his work, of course, did influence in a big way. I don't know if that happened in the 10th century. I don't see that much happening. But in the later half, from the later half of the 11th century, you see a very strong influence of Pampa on epigraphic sources. The other question on whether the whether the Sharanas would identify themselves as descendants of Kalamukas, they certainly wouldn't, because there are some vachanas in which there is a critique of the Kalamukas, there is a critique of the Mahavratis or the Kapalikas, as they're also called. You do have that, and they also do not trace a lineage of sorts to the Nayanars of Tamil Nadu. Although they have much respect for them, they are considered as the 63 Puratanas, and many of them figure very often. Tirujnana Sambandar, for instance, or Rappar, for instance, Sundaramurti Nayanar. So these people occur at many places in the Vachanas of the Sharanas, but they are not regarded as Ardhyas. What is very interesting for me. The Kalidasa, Bana, Malhana, Ohila, these are the Adyas, and then you have Devaradasimaya, Dohara Kakkaya. There is one of the vachanas in one of Basava's vachanas says Adyara Vachana Parusha Kandaya. Parusha is a touchstone. The vachanas of the first of these saints, that's like a touchstone. That's always there for you to test what you yourself want to say. I don't think they had a similar sentiment towards the 63 Nayanars of Tamil Nadu, but the Nayanars were also a revered lot.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can finish this discussion with a comment. Mr. Tarakeshwar was saying something. I'm sorry, I just went to Malini's question. So if you have something to say, could you please repeat?
No, I just wanted to clarify certain things. One is about when I brought in Pampa self-representation. When I say self-representation, this is what he perceives when he made that statement. But apart from that, there are also other text. So how do you put these two together to make sense of the text? And then there is a narration in the text. So by going through the narration, now what sense we make of that? So there is a statement by the author in various places within the text, which are direct intervention from the authorial statements within the text, and there is a contradiction between the two, and then there is a narration, and then there is a context in which the text has appeared. So I was only trying to say that this is one of the ways of looking at it. I called it as self-representation by the author. I was not holding on to that distinction completely too. As I was trying to say, we need to understand the ideological underpinnings of a textual production would be multiple. So if you're looking at the ideological production of a text, you need to look at these multiple forces I was trying to make. Further than that, not much. Thank you.
Okay, Manu, would you respond or we just go for?
Yeah, one of the things that Professor Tarakeshwar said in his first comment was that there's no need to look at the present in Pampa as as an understanding of the present through the past. Rather, it can also be an understanding of the past through the present. So there's also an attempt to recreate the past and understand the past. At least the first three poets of the three major poets of Karnataka, Pampa, Ranna, and Ponna. When I read them, I don't actually get the sense, largely because of the few examples that I gave of how, although the narrative is crafted so dexterously, narration almost becomes impossible because our gaze or our attention is constantly drawn away from the narrative because of the sounds that are being made to create a particular affect. It could be Sringara, it could be Veera, and so on. And tradition itself within Karnataka, this is more important for me, might not have seen this as an attempt to understand the past, because Pampa Bharatam, to the best of my knowledge, is available only in 6 manuscripts, one of which is in Ara. Ara is in Bihar. I don't know what it was doing in Bihar, but there's Jaina monastery there and it was kept there. But when you come to the 15th century text of Kumara Vyasa, the Mahabharata that he wrote, that has been so popular that we have hundreds of manuscripts of this text. And until very recently, there was this rich tradition of the Bhagavatas who almost committed the entire text to memory. And I don't think it's possible for an average Kannada-speaking person today to make sense of the 2 stanzas from Pampa that I read out. But I don't think there is any Kannadiga today who has a problem understanding Kumaravyasa. It's so modern in terms of the language, and it's much more rooted in the past. The past for the past's sake itself, one could call it. That is missing in Pampa.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have a very important part left out, and that is the proposing the vote of thanks, which will be done by our head of the department, Professor Bhangia Bhukia. Please, Bhangia.
Thank you so much, Manu, Devadevan, for the kind of a wonderful lecture. It was a really very, very inspiring and provoking lecture. Yeah, I mean, you have very well down the various trajectories in the Kannada Vachana Kavya. I could see a lot of parallels actually with Telugu. Of course, Telugu script developed from Kannada script, and both the languages were actually developing at the same time. And a lot of things actually taken from Kannada. So I mean, one thing I couldn't actually understand. I mean, how Sanskrit actually was influencing this say Rasa and Bhava genre in Kannada literature, because you see this Rasa and Bhava more and more as the Sanskrit was coming into this Vachana or original Kannada literature. So that is one. But anyway, so I was thinking to ask you this, but yeah, there is a time limit and all that. We have already crossed something about 2 hours and 15 minutes. Okay, anyway, I'll speak to you.
It shows the success.
And but thank you so much, all the listeners and participants, particularly Professor Aloka ma'am, for joining our webinar series and making it more interesting and all. And also one of our student actually, Arun Thomas, is involved in making all the posters, the beautiful posters actually made by him, and we also thank him. So thank you so much. And also chair. So Chandra.
Who is the chair? Where is the chair?
Yeah, moderator. Yeah. Thank you.
So we thank each other.
Yes.
Thank Anindita and for initiating the series of questions and thoughts. And thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Varghese, not the list. I
Yeah.
should thank Varghese for inviting Manu so that we had such a wonderful.
He's the host. We all are guests.
We are all guests. Varghese and Vijay. And thank you, Vijay, for putting in Malini's question from the YouTube. I don't know how to get the YouTube questions. That I have to learn.
No, see, if you see on the top, you see live and
Live on YouTube. Yeah, yeah.
So if you there is a this icon. If you click on this, view screen on YouTube.
Okay, here.
Can you see?
View screen on YouTube, yes.
If you click that, you will go to another YouTube.
Okay, then I can see the questions there.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.